Here's a question. How do you have an open source and public ledger without revealing any information about the transactions on the ledger? Well, Monero's managed it, so stick around and let's find out. Hey guys, I'm Sprague, and if you were to look at a list of the 20 oldest cryptocurrencies, you'd see that most of them at this point have slipped down the rankings and faded into somewhat obscurity. But one that you cannot say that for is Monero, still fighting for a spot up there with the biggest coins. But sitting on a market cap of $7 billion, Monero isn't like a lot of the other coins in the top 50. Monero's entire ethos is on privacy. But this opens it up to a lot of scrutiny and potential regulation, so alongside figuring out how Monero manages to keep details of each transaction secret, we'll also go into the future implications and survivability of the coin. It'll be fine. But first, the obligatory, I'm not a financial advisor, so please don't take anything in this video as anything other than educational. And if you enjoy the content, please consider hitting subscribe. Now, usually at this point, I would talk about the company or the creators of the coin, but similar to Bitcoin, there's a lot of confusion and mystery surrounding the creation of Monero. So here's just a brief rundown of events. These days, we're used to coins and chains being created by big companies that have got investor backing. But Monero was created in a simpler time by a user called Thankful4Today, who forked the code base of another privacy-based coin called Bytecoin and named it BitMonero. The name BitMonero is rather uninventively just Bitcoin, where the coin part is the Esperanto term Monero. The initial forking and creation of BitMonero happened because there was concerns that the creators of Bytecoin had tampered with the supply. But the code base was perfect for what Monero set out to achieve. There were a few flaws inherent in the Bytecoin code it was forked from, but these could be fixed later. And due to the fact that it was using the CryptoNote protocol authored by Nicholas van Saberhagen, there was the perfect starting point for a privacy-orientated currency such as Monero. As I mentioned, some things about the Bytecoin code weren't perfect, and the slow progress on fixing these led to voices of dissent rising in the Monero community. These voices then led to Thankful4Today being either ousted or leaving the community, depending on who you ask, and instead Johnny Mnemonic, a user who'd been there for the initial forking, stepping in to lead. However, Johnny Mnemonic was not the developer on the project. In fact, this was Taco Time, a relatively well-known developer from the early days of crypto, who went on to create Memcoin 2, which later became Decred. It was also around this time that the takeover happened that BitMonero was renamed to simply Monero. These days, Monero is just worked on by the Monero project, which is a loose group of individuals who all come together to keep Monero moving forwards. However, if you check the GitHub for Monero, you will find that there is over 250 contributors, and the last code update was 4 days ago, so the project is steaming ahead. Fortunately, even though Monero's background is shrouded in mystery, the tech isn't. So let's take a dive into how Monero reaches its privacy-driven goals. Along the same egalitarian ethos that Monero takes, that everyone is equal and deserves equal rights, Monero uses proof of work, which means that anyone can mine and start earning Monero. However, unlike Bitcoin, which pioneered the proof of work algorithm, Monero actually uses a modified version, which protects it against specialized miners like ASICs. This means that unlike Bitcoin, where at this point mining has become so specialized that hours of research, money and investment need to go into starting a profitable farm, Monero is much more fair, and even those on lower end hardware could see a profit eventually. This adds a secondary benefit in that it aids the decentralization of Monero, because whereas the majority of Bitcoin's hashing power can be traced back to specific farms located around the world, anyone can start mining on Monero, and means that anyone could be a block validator. Now, obviously Monero farms do and will still exist, however without ASIC miners it means that it's harder for someone to capitalize on the hashing power of the network. Unlike other chains where the consensus mechanism or the chain itself is what makes it interesting, with Monero it's the CryptoNote protocol that backs it that truly makes this chain special. Obfuscation on the Monero chain boils down to three distinct technologies: ring signatures, stealth addresses, and ring CT, which deals with hiding the sender, the receiver, and the amount transacted in that order. To understand ring signatures, first we need to understand how a blockchain transaction actually works, because while you might think that you just take a single input of say 1 XMR and send it to a single output, This is actually not the case, with each transaction being made up of multiple inputs and potentially multiple outputs. To understand this, we can use a simple analogy. Let's say you go to a restaurant and you split the bill with whoever you are there at that restaurant with. You are now using multiple inputs to pay a single output. However, let's say that you also wanted to leave a tip alongside your bill, which goes straight to the server and not to the restaurant. You're now adding a second output to that transaction. The way that Monero hides the identity of the sender is it chooses 10 input transactions that have previously happened on the chain. These 10 plus the real input will then be recorded as the inputs to that transaction. This means that anyone looking at the network will not know which of the 11 is the real input. However, protecting the sender isn't really important if you could just track down who the receiver was, and that's where stealth addresses play their role. Whereas in most blockchains you have a private key, which is then used to create a public key and therefore a public address, in the Monero chain instead you have a private key and a private viewing key, which are used in conjunction with each other to generate a new address for every single transaction. In the same way that generating a public key from a private key is a one-way act, generating a new address using a private key and private view key is also one way. This means that if you hold the viewing key, you can see and interact with all of the addresses that you have generated. However, there is no way for someone looking at the network to link different addresses together by who generated them. But the astute among you are probably thinking, if you can see the transactional amount, you could just trace the value back to the point of origin for that coin. And technically, before 2017, this actually was possible. But in that year, Ring CT was implemented, which to be honest is so complex I could do an entire video just about it. But here's the essentials. The value of each transaction is hashed in a way that only the receiver can see how much Monero was actually sent. This alongside using the Peterson commitments, which is essentially just a list of ways to check that Monero is not being created out of thin air and it is in fact a valid transaction, mean that the transaction amount is completely obfuscated to anyone but the receiver. Now, while these three technologies do technically make every single Monero transaction completely opaque, there are some privacy concerns to take into account. Linked down below is a 2018 paper that identified two primary weaknesses within the Monero chain, and they are as follows. Because initially Ring CT was not a part of the network, it means that any transactions written to the chain prior to February 2017 could, through analysis, be traced back to the sender or recipient. This is because you could use the transactionary amount to follow the coin back to its point of origin. And secondly, ring signature mix-ins or decoys can usually be identified using coin age distribution. What this means is that you can normally identify which is the real sender by which one had the most recent output. This does mean that with enough analysis, a coin might be able to be traced back to its original sender. However, these are minor concerns given the complexity involved. They are also not Monero's biggest problem. Monero's biggest problem is the government. Governments hate privacy. In their eyes, privacy is equal to illegality. And while most of us would like a private currency away from prying eyes, especially when it comes to financial matters, to the government, they will view this that all private coins are being used for illegal activity. However, this black and white stance is like suggesting that fiat, with its relative transparency, has never been used for anything illegal, which is just a ridiculous stance to take. This stance could be bad for Monero, because while they couldn't outright ban the use of Monero, they could pressure fiat on-off ramps and exchanges to delist it. Earlier this year, Bittrex was one of a few exchanges to delist various privacy coins, Monero included. And while they haven't stated what their reason for doing so was, there is speculation that it was because of regulatory pressure. And it's for these reasons that, in my opinion, we need Monero. And anyone that is holding Monero is holding what is essentially part of why crypto was created: financial anonymity. When Satoshi Nakamoto created Bitcoin, he didn't realize the lengths that the government would go to try and find the identities of a pseudo-anonymous coin such as Bitcoin. And where in his ideal version of Bitcoin, it was meant to be anonymous with a wallet address seemingly being owned by anyone in the world, In actual fact, due to the KYC required by exchanges and fiat on-off ramps, this isn't the case anymore, with pretty much all Bitcoins being able to be traced through some length of analysis. And this is why, if we want true financial independence, we need to support coins like Monero. Because at the end of the day, it's not just the governments that matter when it comes to being on a public ledger. Any nefarious individuals could, in theory, find out your net worth when the world moves to using digital currencies as the primary currency. Because when you've got a public ledger, all it takes is a certain amount of analysis and a certain amount of information about you, which, this is the age of the internet and doxings happen all the time, means that you could be at risk. So realistically, privacy coins aren't a bad thing, and they aren't just being used for illegal activity like the government would suggest. And by supporting something like Monero, you are supporting the crypto scene as a whole and what it set out to achieve in the first place. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, please leave me a like. If you've got any suggestions for coins that I could do in the future, leave them down in the comments below. And if you just generally enjoy the content, please consider hitting the subscribe button. Thanks.